so Jim Crow walked so the Nazis could run. You know, racist policy really creates racists to justify the policy, not the other way around. Germans were actually jealous of the Jews, so they create laws that make it acceptable for us to be racist towards them. For the material benefit just of their property, ultimately to ease their conscience after they were just stealing from them. Racism exists only to justify our mistreatment of other people. We can all comfortably say it was just a bug when we ultimately squash them. We are okay with extermination so long as we are sure to belittle the population and your psyche. They were just Jews, they were just Mexicans, they were just immigrants.
So some biographers of Hitler say that he was really a bit of a lame.
The Nazi Party did not get this idea in a vacuum. By the end of this video, you will understand how the Nazis convinced a population that extermination was okay. In the history of the 20th century, two systems of racial oppression stand out for their cruelty and far-reaching impact. The Jim Crow laws in the American South, as well as the racist policies of Nazi Germany. Although these systems were in different parts of the world, they share a disturbing connection. And what if I told you the Nazis looked to America for inspiration? The shocking link between these regimes reveals a disturbing truth about the global spread of racist ideologies.
Developed these discriminatory laws against Jews, the Nuremberg codes, by studying our Jim Crow laws.
In the American South, Jim Crow laws emerged in the aftermath of the Civil War and Reconstruction. These laws codified racial segregation and discrimination against Black Americans, touching every aspect of life from education and public spaces to marriage and voting rights. The term Jim Crow itself comes from a racist caricature and minstrel shows. Isabel Wilkerson reveals how Jim Crow laws were rooted in something deeper than racial discrimination, a complex caste system that shaped America's social hierarchy.
Who were escaping the Jim Crow South, and in writing about what they had endured, writing about what
Unlike race, which she calls the visible decoy, caste represents the invisible infrastructure that determines every aspect of life, from resource distribution to human dignity. Caste systems create not just legal barriers, but the psychological and spiritual that convince us all of our natural positions in a society. The Nazis, in studying Jim Crow laws, were learning how to construct a similar social order that could make systemic oppression feel divinely ordained and inevitable. In the 1930s, the Nazi Party rose to power on a platform of racial hatred, particularly targeting Jewish people. This was determining a time when the Germans were looking for a scapegoat for their declining country.
The two-front war now no longer existed from March 1918.
Many people bought into the cause without knowing where this mentality could manipulate them towards. Think of mindsets and beliefs as germs in an ecosystem of our collective psyche. We do not know which infections or beliefs are cancerous until they grow. The Nazi Party beliefs obtained mainstream control and began implementing increasingly severe anti-Jewish policies, all in line with the long-term plan of Hitler. So here's what they do not teach you in school. The laws of the Nazi lawyers look to for inspiration didn't come out of thin air like a bunny from a magician's hat. They look to America as a model. James Q. Whitman, a professor at Yale Law School and author of Hitler's American Model, explains,
America in the early 20th century was the leading racist jurisdiction in the world. Nazi lawyers, as a result, were interested in, looked very closely at, and were ultimately influenced by American race law.
This raises a crucial question. What exactly did the Nazis find so appealing about American racial policies? To answer this, we need to look deeper into specific areas of Nazi interest. First, there were the Jim Crow segregation laws themselves. The Nazis initially debated whether to implement similar segregation in Germany. They admired how these laws created a rigid racial hierarchy and limited the rights of Black Americans. However, they ultimately decided this approach wouldn't be severe enough for their aims. Whitman notes,
one of the most striking Nazi views was that Jim Crow was a suitable racist program in the United States because American blacks were already oppressed and poor, but then in Germany, by contrast, where the Jews as the Nazis imagined it were rich and powerful, it was necessary to more severe measures.
While they didn't directly copy Jim Crow segregation, the Nazis were deeply interested in other aspects of American race law. A particular interest was how the US had designated certain groups as non-citizens. Even if they lived within its borders or territories, this applied to Native Americans, Filipinos, and others. The Nazis saw this as a useful model for stripping rights from Jewish Germans. Perhaps most disturbing were the American Anti-Miscegenation Laws, which prohibited interracial marriages in 30 of the 48 states. Whitman explains,
America had by a wide margin the harshest law of this kind. In particular, some of the state's laws threatened severe criminal punishment for interracial marriage. That was something radical Nazis were very eager to do in Germany as well.
To fully appreciate the extent of Nazi interest in American race law, we need to examine a key historical event, a meeting of Nazi Germany's leading lawyers on June 5, 1934. This gathering, chaired by Hitler's Minister of Justice, was convened to begin creating what would eventually be known as the Nuremberg Laws. A stenographer was present to record a verbatim transcript of the meeting. Reading this transcript, Whitman discovered a startling fact. The meeting began with a discussion of American law. The Minister of Justice presented a memorandum on American race law that included detailed discussion of laws from various American states. Even more troubling, Whitman found that most radical lawyers in that meeting, the most vicious among the lawyers present, were the most enthusiastic for the American example. These influences culminated in the infamous Nuremberg Laws of 1935. Let's examine those laws and their American parallels more closely. The Nuremberg Laws consisted of three main components: the Reich citizenship law. This stripped Jewish Germans of their citizenship, reducing them to nationals without full rights. The law for protection of German blood and German honor. This banned marriages and sexual relations between Jews and Germans or kindred bloods. The Reich flag law, which pretty much made the swastika the sole national flag of Germany.
In a situation of great post-war turmoil in Bavaria and Germany as a whole, rampant in
The American parallels to these laws, the citizenship law, drew inspiration from how America treated Native Americans, Filipinos, and other non-citizens. The blood law clearly echoed American anti-miscegenation laws. But here's where things get even more chilling. In crafting these laws, the Nazis faced a problem: how to legally define who counted as Jewish. Once again, they looked to the American laws for the answer. American laws had developed complex systems for racial classification, particularly the notorious one-drop rule, which classified anyone with any black ancestry as black. The Nazis studied these classifications methods intensely. Controversial one-drop rules in America stipulated that anyone with any black ancestry was legally black and could not marry a white person. Laws also defined that what made a person Asian or Native American to prevent these groups from marrying whites. Notably, Virginia had a Pocahontas exception for primarily white families who claimed to be descended from Pocahontas. The Nazi system for determining Jewish ancestry ended up being less extreme from the American laws. The Nazis decreed that a person was Jewish if they had 3 or more Jewish grandparents. In contrast, the American one-drop rule could classify someone as black based on a single black ancestors generations back.
This is me quoting their laws. One drop of Negro blood makes you black in America.
Whitman said,
American racial classification law was much harsher than anything the Nazis themselves were willing to introduce in Germany.
The very architects of the Holocaust found some racial laws from America to be too extreme for their tastes. As these systems of oppression took hold, the consequences were devastating in both countries. In the American South, Jim Crow created a long-lasting system of inequality enforced through both legal means and terrifying violence like lynchings. In Nazi Germany, anti-Jewish policies escalated rapidly, culminating in the horrors of the Holocaust. It's crucial to note that while these disturbing parallels, these systems were not identical. Jim Crow, for all of its cruelty, did not aim at genocide. The Nazi regime's ultimate goal were far more extreme. Actually, Hitler was sort of pushed to these extreme ideals because he tried to fight a two-front war and he could not win that war. So Jim Crow was primarily a regional system within the US, while the Nazis' racial policies were national in scope. Nevertheless, the connections were real and noticed by people at the time. In the early 1930s, some Americans were expressed admiration for Nazi ideas. American eugenists welcomed Nazi theories about racial purity, and the famous aviator Charles Lindbergh accepted a medal from the Nazi Party in 1938. To understand the full scope of this connection, we need to examine the role of eugenics in both societies. Eugenics, a pseudoscientific ideology arguing that genetically inferior people should be sterilized to prevent offspring with undesirable traits, gained significant popularity in the American 20th century. The historian Peter Hayes notes in Ken Burns' documentary, The U.S. and the Holocaust, that many in the U.S. at this time came to believe that issues of urbanization, including a spread of disease, were the fault of immigration. This led to support for eugenics among prominent Americans.
Hitler was very influenced in 1983 by the successful coup staged by...
In 1910, over 1 million Jewish immigrants were living in New York City, about a quarter of the city's population, and concerns grew that these new immigrants would eventually replace Protestant Americans. Some Americans, including figures as prominent as Henry Ford, Helen Keller, why is Helen Keller on this list, and Alexander Graham Bell, began championing eugenics. The documentary quotes a writing from roughly 1914 attributed to former President Theodore Roosevelt.
I wish very much that the wrong people could be prevented entirely from breeding, and when the evil nature of these people is sufficiently flagrant, this should be done. Criminals should be sterilized and feeble-minded persons forbidden to leave offspring behind them.
Many states passed a sterilization law based on these ideas. Historians note that eugenics preached in the US gave Nazis a blueprint of sorts. As historian Neil Irvin Painter explains,
the idea was that the bad people have to stop reproducing, and the good people need to produce more. Negative eugenics says sterilize the wrong people, snuff them out. And that's eugenics that the Nazis would pick up on.
Hitler, who wrote Mein Kampf during his imprisonment in 1924, was apparently pleased with these developments. He was happy in the US and saw itself to be a nomadic Germanic state, and had acted to preserve its purity by excluding certain races. So he loved that shit. Interesting, in some aspects, the Nazis' policy at that time were less harsh than some of Jim Crow's laws implemented in the US. When criticized for their policies, the Nazis often pointed to the American South as justification for whatever laws they were trying to pass. Historian Peter Hayes explains,
they would be able to say, you say that we should not treat these people who we regard as inferior badly, but you do it. You have lynchings in the United States. You make it difficult for them to vote. So how dare you reproach us for this?